Motion made, approved by chair.
So
Approve the
moved.
agenda, it's moved. Seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, public comment. Ms. Huff, do we have anybody from the public here?
No member.
No, we do not. So next item, consent agenda minutes. I have two technical edits to the minutes. One is under number 4, consent. There is a mysterious E that has been added. It's listed. I think that is, the chair. It's me. Because there are only 2 of us on this, regular members that can, so that should be the chair. And then the last page, second paragraph from the end, said that the chair received and accept the audit and Catherine. I think that should be, that's the board received, because it's the committee saying the board, here's the audit to receive and approve this. Those are the 2 changes. So move.
So moved.
Second. Any other comments? Favor?
Aye.
Minutes as amended. Approved. Okay, now we're on to read of the agenda, talking about simple topic of the winter.
Thank you. So referencing the email I sent out on the 23rd. So we last left off on the winter average. We had presented 5 options to the board, just to refresh everybody's memory. One was just to maintain the current cap. The second was to adjust the winter quarter average cap and then have eligibility criteria. That if you're only eligible if you use 1,000 gallons or more during that quarter average. And then we had option 3, same eligibility criteria, but we actually have a true winter quarter cap, whatever your usage is, as long as you use more than 1,000 gallons. We looked at an option where we had the winter peak, and then we had an option where we eliminated it altogether. So last time we talked, the board had asked us to look at a hybrid where we had the winter quarter average cap to the actual water usage, and then didn't have this criteria where you had to use 1,000 gallons to qualify. So if you jump forward, Lorna, 1 slide. So this is the hybrid option between 3 and 4. So we're setting the cap based on usage from December through February, regardless of usage. Single family resident. We looked at 2 options, having the cap at either 3,000 or 4,000 gallons for those with the 0 usage during that winter average. So if you're under 1,000 gallons or under 3,000 gallons, you get capped at 3,000 or 4,000 gallons per month. New customers, we didn't change. And then we looked at the revenue impact. And if we capped those customers at 3,000 gallons, the impact would be a net revenue loss of about $530,000. And then with 4,000 cap, slightly less at $430,000. And what we're seeing, and Diana and I were on the phone for most of that day.
The numbers are different than what
That is incorrect.
That is incorrect.
Yeah, the email I sent out on the 29th is correct. What's printed tonight is incorrect. So the number should be 530 and 430. The rest of the slide's fine. Now, the reason for this is, and we kind of try to explain it in the email when I sent out the email on the 29th, we actually have a revenue loss by eliminating the cap of $430,000. We were generating revenue then by excluding the 1,000, if you go back a slide, Lauren. we actually were generating revenue by having this eligibility criteria. That was offsetting the decrease we had by the change in the cap in the options previously. So when we set this criteria in option 2 and 3, we generated a revenue of about $320,000. The reason for that is, I think we gave an example in the email on the 29th, is we went through, looked for some big users. We had customers with 0 reads in 2 months out of the winter quarter average. And the third month it jumped up to 12,000 gallons. And then throughout the rest of the year, their usage was between 40 and 50,000 gallons. So we definitely do have snowbirds that are not using water during the winter quarter average because they're either not here. They come back in late February. You see the end use of the month, and then the peak use throughout the year. So by creating this criteria, we're able to gain that revenue to offset the adjustment to the cap. The revenue hit when we looked at the city, we presented the very general version of what we have here tonight to Council Board Work Group. The city is impacted by 0.5 to 2% in these scenarios. They're a little more impacted than we are, but less of a revenue cost, but higher percentage. So I think when we look back at this, the recommendation we made back in January, towards the end of January, we were thinking that having some sort of either the cap or the peak with the being able to qualify based on usage in those quarters made sense to us. Given that we do have customers that are using a large volume of water and they have no usage during the winter quarter. It's never going to be perfect. But that's kind of where we landed. I don't know, Dan, if you have anything to add about the data.
In the DC region, generally, what do the other utilities do?
Fairfax County has a true count. I don't know if they have a correct eligibility criteria.
Yeah, most will have a quarterly average, a standard quarterly average for a cap, if they're gonna have a cap. Or have none. Some have none. Smaller municipalities, they tend not to have as much usage. They might bill everything.
I mean, even revenue looks large at, even if you jump forward $500,000, it's about 1% of our revenue. If you think about our overall revenue is 54 million. That's including the Fairfax contributions as well.
So to make that up, would we need to raise our rates some amount?
Right.
Roughly how much?
We haven't done that count, but we certainly could to make up the $500,000 loss. It's this option.
Yeah, 1%.
We had looking at a 5% increase, it'd be 6. 5 order of magnitude, right?
Going into this year, it'd be 6.1 instead of 5.
But if your bill is $70 a month, you'd be paying $71 a month. It's not big.
It's not a big, it's not a big swing as far as your rates are concerned. Interchange, it just.
I think the last time when we had this discussion, I think Ms. Hammer brought up the point that we wanted to, when we looked at whether or not the program was equitable, by excluding customers that are using less than 1,000 gallons during that wear average. I guess what we're finding is that there are customers that are benefiting from that 4,000 gallon cap now because their winter quarter average, in the example I gave you, is 3,200, but they're using 40 to 50,000 gallons per month. So there's again, I think when we talk about this and we answer the question to the public, there's no perfect way to set this up. But I think from our standpoint, given we've been raising rates, we didn't want to potentially go down this avenue of additional rate increases to support the change in the cap. Again, I will note that we've had 2 complaints about the cap since it was put in place in 2012. So one recently with this board and one about 3 or 4 years ago.
So is staff recommendation leave it as is, or one of these other options?
I think if we go back a slide, when we wrote the email on the 29th, we still I would recommend option 3, where we have the minimum cap and there's precedent in the United States on that. You can argue the peak any way you want. You can have a peak in the winter. You can have higher use in the winter than you do in summer, potentially, if you have a big family. So we talked about that a little bit last time too. But we still like the idea of eliminating that. The arbitrary 4,000 gallon cap right now, we think should definitely be eliminated because it's from a point of fairness, if you're trying to conserve, we should be recognizing that from our customers. And then we truly do have non-users during that quarterly period where we have an impact.
Under option 3, you show numbers with no factor and a 1.2 factor. Can you explain that a little bit more, what the 1.2 does?
Yes, that was a number picked out of the sky. We hadn't seen anybody else do this in the United States. The idea was with no factor, say we have the you use 2,400 gallons in the winter quarter. What we're trying to do is, maybe that doesn't account for all your indoor usage. You're trying to put a little factor on that to show how that would impact revenue. So, 1.1 or 1.2 factor on top of that usage, you take that usage multiplied by 1.1 and 20%, kind of like a safety factor to ensure we're capturing all the indoor usage was the idea. And that gives us a bandwidth to kind of understand how sensitive this analysis was too.
I guess my question goes back to, if we do propose option 3 with a factor so that we aren't losing 0.2%, which I guess it doesn't really matter, but just how would we message that?
I think it's hard. I think we would elect not to do a factor and just have a hit of 110,000 on the revenue and adjust the rates accordingly the following year.
I think that is fair, that if you have a 0 read, you don't get billed for it. But you also, if you have a 0 read, then you don't get to take the average of the 3 months.
Correct, you're not eligible.
I think getting rid of the 1.2 makes sense because we can't explain that.
Yeah.
I think it's
Agreed.
But it did give you, when we looked at it, it just gave you an idea of how sensitive, these numbers are that we're looking at, how much you could throw off your revenue.
I was kind of hoping you had a good explanation.
No.
Well, there are some utilities, to Justin's point, for the example, there are some utilities that do put a cap based on your water consumption, like a % of your water consumption. So there's some precedence to do something like that. But a lot of times they might look at sort of like the ebb and flow to try to estimate what that irrigation use is to kind of cap it. So you could try to do some more analysis and get it to be fine perfect, but I think that may be where the direction was going with that option.
Right now we have an arbitrary cap of 4,000 that, yes, you can explain it, but it takes a very long couple sentences to explain why we have a 4,000 gallon cap. I think the eligibility criteria seems fair. If you're not here, we have 0 reads, you don't qualify if you're using that little bit of water. Easier to explain.
And the rate adjustment for the following year for $110,000 type would be minimal.
You
0.2%,
could bake it into the longer range planning and adjust for it.
1%, it's no 5.1 be 3.
If we did it next year. Yeah.
Definitely better than the 1%, yeah.
It was interesting. I didn't think going through the data opened our eyes a little bit to see that there are actually customers that you hear the rumors that people can try and game the system, but maybe they're not trying to, but they're definitely benefiting. There are customers out there benefiting from the current system. Probably less than 1% of our customers, but it's there. So I think long-term, these are short-term changes. Long-term, we will be discussing affordability coming up in March, the March board meeting in more depth. We are working on the staff memo, prepped up to 15 pages. So we want to get that prepared and finalized for the March board meeting and discuss some of the issues going on with VAW. And we do have some ideas of talking about this globally, larger, long-term on affordability as part of our affordability discussion too. Whether or not you can leverage this type of a program to support affordability and what's sustainable and what's equitable. That's out there a little bit more on this.
Maybe we could just say, bring these recommendations to the board. We could amend one specific.
Or do we want to wait till March to have the larger discussion and how this fits in?
I think the discussion in March is a little more like a 5-10 year plan.
Okay.
As opposed to, I think we have a program now that we've received some community feedback on, and we find as staff that it isn't necessarily equitable to set an arbitrary cap of 4,000. This is an easy change. It's an easy billing change. I think longer term, different rate structures, things like that around the affordability program is something that would change this even further and have other classes and things like that.
Okay, so you see this as a step process?
Yeah. I think this is I hate saying the word quick fix, but a quick win, quick fix to address what we inherited that we see as an issue and make it a little more streamlined.
So the question was, do we make a motion to take one of these to the larger board?
That's correct. Or do we just bring them all to the larger board and have this discussion with 5 of us instead of 4 of us?
I guess we could bring all 5 since John was not able to weigh in. I move to bring all 5 options to the full board at our next board meeting.
Second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Carl, do you have what you need for the?
Yeah.
So easy when John's here. We don't have to move things up to the board meeting.
Order of business is financial planning process.
So while Lorna gets the slides up, we did want to take time going back and looking. The last time that we went through a financial planning process with the board was in 2014, so 10 years ago. We did talk a little bit about financial planning when we set the rates up for AlexRenew with the Raftellus team, but we thought it'd be a good time with our new board to take a step back as we enter our budget cycle for next fiscal year to review what our financial planning process actually consists of. So Ms. Fian's going to kick off the presentation, supported by Ms. Ling, and Mr. Bovary and Mr. Akankube and myself are here to support and answer questions. We meant tonight's presentation to be more of a discussion. So as we go through the slides, feel free to, pause and have a discussion. It is an informational presentation that we want the board to understand because we think it would benefit our financial planning process moving forward. So we're kind of lifting the hood of the Ferrari here and taking a look under the rate model. And
Ferrari. Your rate model is now a Ferrari.
Hopefully it can four-wheel pretty good too.
fair warning, there are many bar graphs. I'm sure if you looked at the presentation, there are so many bar graphs, but I think having the context and Mr. Jinks going back to our questions around last year and our surplus, I think tonight's presentation will answer some of those questions as well.
Covered a lot
I
of
did.
it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chair, committee members. So I'm just gonna stream into this. So I, like Justin or Mr. Carl said, that a lot of what we're covering tonight are graphs and charts, and they can kind of, in preparing for tonight, I was trying to make sure there was a full connection as we move through and that you're staying with me. So I'm gonna try and make sure that's connected and make sure you raise your questions as you see fit, making this into a conversation rather than just a presentation. It really is intended to be a little bit different from last year's presentation which was on just rate history, and be more of a getting inside of our mind as we develop our budget, as we develop our rate recommendations in concert with our rate consultants. So tonight, we'll kick it off from the standpoint of background slides. There's just a couple. It's information that you've probably seen before, but it's helpful guidance as we get into the terminology and pieces that we look at from the standpoint of a rate study. I'll walk through the financial planning process. So it includes our budget. It also includes our rates and links into our capital planning process and our audit, and how all those pieces fit together on a yearly basis. And then we'll look at revenues and expenses and how we consider each of those elements from our operating expenses, our operating revenues, and how those break those down and feed those into our rate study and our budget on a yearly basis. And then this Lang will open up the Ferrari and let you all see a little bit more about what the rate model includes, how it's set up, and how we prepare a rate recommendation on a yearly basis. So from the standpoint of our background, the best place to start from our budget and rate perspective are really our main source of revenues. And that's driven by the build flows that we treat here at AlexRenew's wastewater treatment plant. The greatest customer is, of course, our wholesale customer, Fairfax County. And then the remainder of our build flows comes from our ratepayers in the city of Alexandria. And that's divided into our commercial customer class. This includes multifamily buildings, so residential buildings as well, our single family residential homes, and then the smallest class is industrial. From the standpoint of how we bill Fairfax County, we meter those flows and then bill Fairfax County accordingly. For our residential ratepayers, we receive meter data from Virginia American Water, and that's how we bill our ratepayers. A terminology note as we walk through the slide, we're talking about build flows, but we also talk about treated flows on the next slide, and then a couple other slides. Treated flows are just build flows plus our wet weather flows. So, yeah.
Fairfax, yeah, so they pay, we have a budgeted amount for them for operating in the capital, is a different formula. So on the budget side, they're paying us on the basis of usage during the year, or do they pay us the basis of estimates and then we true up at the end of the year? I remember there was a true up at the end of the year, and I was trying to recall what it was for.
I'll show you in 2 slides, but it's an estimate or a projection as we put together our budget, and then a true up at the end of the year based on actual flows. the next important piece of us putting together our budget and our rates are the actual financial policies that drive each of these pieces. And some of the considerations that go into planning are how much or our debt service coverage, making sure that we have sufficient funding to cover our yearly payment to debt service. Also making sure that we have sufficient coverage or minimum reserve for our approximately 120 days of operating expenses incorporated into our budget. And then from the standpoint of funding our capital improvement program, the policies mandate that approximately 15% of the capital improvement program is funded via cash as opposed to debt. And then the last piece of just a consideration that we have to present a 3-year budget and a 10-year capital improvement program to the board on an annual basis. And so next month, that's what you'll be seeing from us.
Before you leave this, just, I'm trying to picture it now. So when you guys go into budget season, 15% of revenue has to go into the capital improvement. Is it per year? So like, do you go in beginning of budget, see the projected revenues, set aside 15% of that, or is there another way?
So this is a conversation that we've been having because it's really 15% on a 10-year basis needs to be funded from cash. And so it's not necessarily year to year that you're seeing 15% of our capital improvement program, but the driver on it is really to not be an entirely debt funded capital organization. And so the conversations that we've been having as we've been getting additional grant funding is that also plays into driving down debt. So it's driving down or it's increasing the amount of quote unquote cash that's used. So as we put together our budget, we take into account approximating a 15%, but it's not an exact science because we know that on a year-to-year basis, we're just trying to hit an average over the 10 years.
In some cases, you're gonna have a big capital program show up in one particular year. You got a contract once. You're not gonna make the 15 that year, but the next year you may not have very much, and you may be more than 15. So it's really an average over.
Exactly. Yes. Any other questions on this slide? And then the final piece of background is just about the service agreements that are in place that really drive us putting together our revenues and expenses. So on the left side of the slide, we have Fairfax County. They're a wholesale customer. So they send flows here for treatment. And for that, we treat a portion, or Fairfax County pays us a portion of our operating expenses. So when I was saying billed flows versus treated flows, what's shown here are the treated flows across the last several years. And so for the portion of treated flows that Fairfax County is sending here, that's the portion that they are paying of our operating expenses. The service agreement also stipulates that Fairfax County pays a portion of on a percent basis of our capital improvement program. And so that comes in as contributions on a yearly basis.
So the measurement flows like from their front sewers right before it shows up at our front door. Something like that, right?
I wish the calculation were that simple.
Yeah. Just kind of conceptually.
Correct.
Right.
Conceptually. And then, so if they have no I&I program and they have leaky sewers, we're getting that and billing them for it. It's not necessarily their usage. If they have a Cracker Jack system that doesn't leak hardly at all, they get the benefit of that as well.
And I think what, sorry.
Go ahead, keep it.
But with the I&I piece, I think what you can see over time, looking back to 2017 till today, is, Fairfax has done a few things. They've tightened up their system a bit from I&I, infiltration and inflow. They also have the ability to flex and send flows to Noma Coal, and they've done that as well. And you can see that we've had our lowest use of treated flows from Fairfax in 2023 than we've had in recent years. We think that is because the system in certain portions of the city of Alexandria is a bit leaky. Fairfax has tightened up their sewers, and they've also completed some major upgrades at Noma Coal, and they're sending more flow down to the Noma Coal plant. So from a build flow standpoint, we're starting to see that go from less 50-50 to more 40-60 flip towards the city. Currently, we also track on a monthly basis the flow sent to the plant. City's 21.6, Fairfax is 32.4, so we do monitor that as well to make sure everybody's within their service agreement for the flows coming into the facilities.
Agree with they decide to send more of their flow to Norman Cole creates a budget problem for us because particularly if they do more of it during the year after we've set, because the only other main source of revenue we have is our customer rates from Alexandria customers. That's fixed once we set the rate. So that's becomes a.
So as we walk through both the expenses and revenues, we get into Fairfax County's projections for revenues, and you can see that we're trying to be more conservative on projecting revenues from Fairfax County, acknowledging that this is something that we need to not overcompensate for, that there is a drive down.
And so we don't have an agreement with Fairfax that there's a certain flow coming here guaranteed. It's just whatever they need to send to us.
Oh, we do. It's 32.4 is their limit. And they're under their.
Right, but they don't have to send us 32.
No,
That's just their cap of what we can take, but there's no agreement as to how much of that 32.4.
correct.
And so in fact, they're on the operating side, their share is equitable. It's the capital side where they say, hey, look, we're putting in 60% and we're not even close to that number.
Are there limits to how much they can divert to Norman Cole?
I'm not sure.
Do they limit it for operational reasons? Do they limit it because it's cheaper to send it known call than here?
My understanding is Fairfax has been acquiring some other municipalities. I think Falls Church recently came under Fairfax County's umbrella. So as part of managing flows from these other jurisdictions and whatever upgrades they were making at Nome and Cole are now complete, they're able to maximize flow there. I don't know if they do it from a financial standpoint or just ease of operations. But at some point, you know, we're getting way ahead of ourselves. We do have a capacity allocation to deal with at the plant of additional 4 MGD that we'll need to deal with for the city at some point so we can enable growth. And the question is that 4 MGD come from Fairfax and the city buys the share of Fairfax and we go to 56-44 city and Fairfax, or do we try and increase the capacity of the plant by putting in new technologies and keep that waste load allocation that we talked about during the board retreat? So those are all discussions that we're having internally right now, trying to figure out what the right path forward is. Because at some point, that 4 MGD is going to be necessary for the city. We just don't have the waste load allocation potentially to give. So it might be a paperwork exercise with Fairfax, given the trends we're currently seeing. And yes, that would give us more capital would then be placed on the city for 4 more %.
So similarly to Fairfax County, AlexRenew is a wholesale customer to Arlington County for the portion of the city that drains to Arlington County's wastewater treatment plant. And so equally, we pay Arlington County's operating expenses for the portion of flows that we send to their facility. And then there's a set percentage of their capital program that we are also contributing to. We're moving into the financial planning process. So what is on this slide is an approximate year. Our fiscal year runs from July to June. And really, when you look at all the pieces of our financial planning, which includes our audit, our budget, our rate options or rate setting or study, and then our capital planning, it all happens throughout the year. We kick off our budget planning process by setting goals or initiatives in the fall time, and then move into finishing out our audit, and our audited financials feed our budget and our rate study. The rate study is happening in line with the budget planning process and feeding basically the budget document that is presented to the board in March, as well as on rate setting years, we're presenting rate options. And then throughout the year, we are doing capital planning, identifying what needs are happening at the plant and feeding them into the capital improvement program as timing allows. I think we've hit on it a couple of times, but next month we're presenting the preliminary draft of the fiscal year 2025 budget to the board.
Do you do the rate study every year, even though you set rates for 3 years?
To answer, and then if you can add on that we're looking on it, at least in the last several years that I've been here, we reevaluate and make sure that the rate recommendation that was made and adopted by the board still makes sense on a yearly basis. So our budget planning process kicks off with identifying what are the initiatives that we are doing on a yearly basis. And that really drives a lot of what budget numbers are presented. And so this slide just walks through on any given year, generally, what are we trying to do? And starting up at the top, staff that we have on hand are key and crucial to operating our treatment plants. So making sure that we're investing properly in those staff, making sure that we have the resources to process wastewater and that our site is safe and secure. And then funding any sort of improvements that need to be made, both from our improvement, renewal and replacement program or our capital upgrade program, make sure that there's sufficient funding in there for our assets. And then finally, doing all of this in line with our financial policies while we set predictable and affordable rates. So this next slide really starts to kick off the several graphs about what we're looking at on a yearly basis that drive our budget and our rates, our rate study. And so what's shown here is our revenues on the left and our expenses on the right. And these are the various categories that we're going to walk through how we project the pieces of these, the budget that get incorporated in on an annual basis. So starting with our revenues, our operating revenues. So this is, again, billed flows from Fairfax County and our customers. And this is the main source of revenues that are coming in and contributing to how we maintain our fiscal sustainability. The next piece is how Fairfax County contributes to our capital program. So IR&R and capital contributions. And then the final piece is, as we have debt funding our capital program, we have loan proceeds coming in as revenue on a yearly basis. On the other side, looking at our expenses, our operating expenses are our day-to-day costs associated with operating a treatment plant. The next piece is making sure that we're making annual payments on our debt service. And then the actual money that goes out the door to pay for our capital upgrades. Justin alluded to it, but this is what the end of year fiscal year 2023 looked like. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we've seen in the last couple of years and why we've identified that there's kind of this reserves at the end of the year. So starting to look at these budgets or at these buckets and kicking off on the expenses side and walking through how do we project into both our budget and our rate study, the pieces of our expense side. So this and several of the graphs that are coming up have actual expenses on the left side, projected expenses on the right side. And these are all in fiscal years. So we're taking actual expenses up to fiscal year 2023 and then projecting forward 10 years from fiscal year 2024. And so these are the operating expenses. When you break down our total operating expense budget, the biggest driver of our operating expenses are personnel costs. And so on a yearly basis, we're looking at what are our staffing needs? Do we have sufficient staff to do what we need to do as an organization, and feeding that into the budget that then feeds into the rate study. The other piece of that is every 2 years, we're doing a compensation study that ensures that our salaries for our staff are competitive within the industry and the organization to make sure that we're attracting and retaining the staff that we have here. The next piece of our operating expenses are the utilities, chemicals, sludge, the resources that we need to operate the plant on a daily basis, as well as in the general category, these are administrative costs of running an organization like customer service and legal. And so on a yearly basis, we are looking at previous year's budget and validating these costs and any potential increases with the vendors that we have and who support us for these elements of our operating expense. And then the final piece of our operating expense is associated with Arlington County and the contributions that we make to their operating costs. And that really stems from their feeding us their anticipated operating costs, and we're putting that into our budget.
So, I'm sorry, before you move on from that. So very similarly to Fairfax, I'm assuming that we get, in a very simplified version, we get billed for actual flows before it hits their plant for the flows that are coming out of the section of Alexandria that we send. So when I first looked at this, it looked like they're not uniform. Is it not uniform for because the flows are not consistent, because it's based on how much water people are using, or is it not consistent because it is getting more expensive for them to do whatever they do, or is it both?
I would say it's probably a combination of all of the above. They had, you can kind of look at, they had similar to us in 2023 increases in their operating expenses, just like we saw here at our plant associated with chemicals and utilities that were driven by supply chain issues coming out of COVID. And then additionally, it's whatever is being sent to Arlington could be varying on a year-to-year basis.
So how do you project for that? Because that's kind of between 23 and 22. I mean, that was a big swing, right? So are you just kind of putting like extra onto what last year was in hopes that you catch it, or are other things going into it?
I think that was unprecedented. Just it was for us as well. I think that what we're trying to do is look back as best we can, and we do that on a 3 to 5 year basis and try to use what we're seeing on the trend line and to project that forward. Obviously, there are things that are going to come up that we maybe didn't anticipate, like a pandemic that drives supply chain, but that we're doing. That's why we're looking back at this historical data to do our best guess, and that there may be years where we're maybe not hitting the mark on that.
Also that Beauregard ordered seminary down the hill that big developments that are a big apartment that ultimately that big building. Beauregard, so that see where it's a small area and a few things could.
And I was
do it.
thinking that myself, was that with more development there, I'm assuming we have a cap with them, like Fairfax has a cap with us, right?
So, yeah, so we're right now on average, we send about 1.2 MGD to Arlington. The cap from the agreement, which dates back to 1977, is 3 MGD.
Mhm.
And like Mr. Jenks noted, there's a small area plan development that the city has been looking at that could add significant capacity from that area. So we're waiting to see what the city does with that development plan to make projections for the future as well. And that would get fed into the rate model as well. Right now, we could get up closer to at 2.7 to 3 if it develops the way the city thinks it's going to develop. So those DSEP reviews do come into play as we look at expenses on that side as well as on our side. I think we also trade data with Arlington. We do get to review their budget and their projections on an annual basis as well.
And it never, because by gravity, it flows in that direction.
Yeah.
It never makes sense for us to try to.
Did the federal government office building built the pump in to when they built it? Because there was discussion of doing a diverter there and basically saying they could go either because of the question of did the amount of capacity we had at Arlington enough to meet the whole corridor that building, there was discussion about pumping that building over to like the Holmes Run trunk sewer.
Correct. Yeah. I'm smiling because Ms. Via knows that this is something we've been talking about. The Mark Center pump station serves the federal building and we pump over to Arlington. It's the what is it called? What's the building called? Or Mark Center, Mark Center. So Mark Center Pump Station does not flow by gravity to AlexRenew. The concern around the time when it was built was, does the Holmes Run trunk sewer have enough capacity to carry the flow from that development? The answer at the time was no. So it pumps over the hill to Arlington and goes by gravity to Arlington's plant. That's something that's on our list to look at to see if we really need that pumping station or if we could let gravity flows come back to Holmes Run trunk sewer and all the way down here to the plant. But that's something on our radar that we're going to be investigating.
Particularly,
Home.
yeah. Well, I
Lois.
was also thinking particularly as Fairfax sort of tightens up what they're doing, and potentially going to this other treatment plant will have more capacity. Is it more cost effective to?
Let it come here. I mean, that was maybe too aggressive on our part, but it was a first year issue we were discussing, but it's probably a year 2 or 3 item to deal with now. So we do want to investigate letting that pump station come by gravity, because for us, it's maintenance costs that we have to go out there for the operations and maintenance of that pump station. We actually don't own it. We have an agreement with.
I think it's now the FBI. I think it's changed
Yeah.
to federal hands a
So
couple of
there's
times.
administrative side to it as well. The question is for us, is it needed? Probably not, especially once Fairfax has tightened up. Once we learn the Holmes Run trunks, or we could let flows come by gravity to the plant.
But there'll always be a portion of that area that is
Yes,
unlikely to ever be feasible.
correct. Well, I mean, you can build anything, but
Sure,
I don't
but
know if it makes sense.
So again, moving down the buckets, we're looking at again expenses. This is our capital improvement program. So this is expense on a yearly basis. So we present to the board a 10-year capital improvement program annually. And this slide shows what was presented to the board last year for fiscal year 2024. You can see that right now, a significant portion of our capital improvement program is taken up by AlexRenew, and that as the revenue program starts to come to an end, hopefully in some near-term years, that the rest of the capital program for the organization starts to pick back up, and that we're doing upgrades, significant upgrades on our solids process, and then our preliminary and primary processes that are driving that increase. One thing to note that I think we've made this joke several times, but we as engineers are pretty solid in identifying the projected needs for the organization for the next 5 to 7 years, but that you can see that there's a drop off in the out years. And I wouldn't say that that's where we'll go with the capital improvement program, but that's just what we can kind of outline and identify for what we need as an organization, and that there's some acknowledgement that likely there might be other things that come up that we have to take on and are doing in those out years. And Diana will get into how the rate study complements this and make sure that we have some compensation along the way.
what if it's two different?
It's Alex only. So
Oh.
yeah. So it's the Fairfax contributions for revenue, and then that's something. And then the final piece of our expenses on a yearly basis, we're looking at our debt service and refreshing our debt service and really projecting it out for the next 30 years. And so right now, we will be taking on new debt associated with our capital program that is not shown on this slide, but there is another slide that kind of starts to project new debt and how we'll take that on. But this is what was presented in the last year, and it shows that a large amount of our debt service is associated with revenue.
Question, it's more of just as we think about the next issuance of debt service, looking at the rate of increase in debt service, I think some consideration should be given to kind of trying to smooth out the net effect in these 27, 28 and, putting it as we get kind of towards the back end of it. And so, and it's typical with when you're doing rate-related debt issuance to basically create a smooth, try to smooth some of your debt service versus if you're doing just general governmental debt, you tend to just kind of 1/20th a year in this case. I think it's a consideration. We ought to try to see if we can shave a little bit off early starting with, I guess, 27 is when it takes a big jump up.
Switching over to the revenue side and looking at the historical data from the standpoint of build flows associated with our ratepayers, and then looking at the projection moving forward. On a year-to-year basis, we see relatively stable build flows from our ratepayers. The exception really came in 2020 and 2021, where we saw a decrease of flow usage that impacted our revenues. You can see that now we've kind of come back up, stabilized, and that we're moving forward. We're projecting stable build flows, but that we really believe that COVID associated with a decrease in build flows from the ratepayer perspective.
Question, do we have any idea of the conversion of office building to residential? Overall outflow, and then assuming it changes peaks.
So I guess the biggest effect we saw in build flows, so we've been seeing an overall decrease in trends. Ms. Van's going to get to the slide in a few here, but given low flow fixtures, we've just seen increasing concentrations and less flows to the plant over the last 15, 20 years. The development, thank you. So she just brought it up, slide 14. So going back to 2003 to today, you can see our number of accounts is growing in the green line. Our number of equivalent accounts or ERUs is growing, but our flow trend for total bill flows, we can see that continued to decrease over time. And that's because people are more conscious about sustainability. They're also low flow fixtures that had a huge impact on flows to the plant and build flow. So less usage for low flow fixture shower head. I always think about the Seinfeld episode where they had the low flow fixture and everybody's hair was flat versus the like elephant hose coming out. So that's part of that started back in the 90s, and we've seen that happen year over year. We do, for the big developments, look at DSEP. Genelon's one example of those developments that we're concerned about, not just because of plant capacity, but also because that we do look at and we do take note of during our DSEP review. But overall, even though we've seen development kind of increase in the city at a slow rate over time, the flows aren't following.
I'm sorry, what is DSEP?
Development special use permit. It's a city process for any type of work that has to happen.
Does that impact our treatment processes when the flows are much more concentrated?
Yes, it can, to the point where we've had to make significant changes now.
I think that conversion of office to matches any measurable lag in peaks or in usage.
I don't think so, based on the data that we've reviewed. I'd be surprised if it did. I don't know. We'll turn to the people who look at this across the United States.
I think that residential on a per ERC basis, like per person is going to have higher water demands for domestic use. So if you probably have more conversion, you could see some uptake, but it's just a question of like what's being offset. Like, are you going from an office building that had a lot of people packed in cubicles and you know, they had maybe higher use and then you're trading that out for like, you know, 10. So it's a question of like what the density ratio trade-offs are and stuff like that.
The other thing I see is that for planned office development, it's universally going to show up as planned. Oh, we want to change to residential. We're going to see that coming here right now. These discussion plans and so in effect that as you don't get the offset. It's just you're getting something different than what had been planned.
That's what Mr. Carl was talking about, the capacity of the plan.
Just did the press flows really what they got. Because we're in two budget cycles where we were making predictions based on those flows.
Okay.
Or you do you. Okay.
I think the next slide, we're gonna just focus on the accuracy of the rate model and an acknowledgement of how these years have kind of driven AlexRenew's decision-making for the last couple, and that we're, I think with the next budget that we present, gonna come out on the other side. So Rotary and Lang on a yearly basis are projecting what revenues are anticipated for each fiscal year, and that's driven by what's in the rate model. And then at the end of the audit, they're bringing in what was actually incurred by AlexRenew, or what we actually brought in from the revenue standpoint, and validating how close were they on their projection. And so what you see on this slide is that largely the rate model is accurate in predicting revenues outside of, this one 2020 year. We're a little bit off your game, but largely from the low flow aspect. I think from the standpoint of this is where the budget and the rate model slightly diverged in the last couple of years, was the rate model is projecting revenues, but from a standpoint of internally, the management made a decision because of the decrease in revenues coming off of 2020 and 2021 to be more conservative in what revenues we were stating in the budget. And so although the rate model has been accurate in predicting those revenues, we have been under projecting in the budget what revenues would come in. And so it's just important from the standpoint of rates and what we saw as we came out of last year, that sort of surplus, or what appeared to be a surplus, wasn't actually reflected in the rate model.
The rate model projected the revenues correctly. The budget did not. Will be 2 years straight. So the first budget inherited and last year's budget that we inherited, that we're working on correcting. Rate model is correct, but the budget number presented was based on that 2020 and 2021 year of depressed flows, and a hedge that revenue would be lower.
And wanting to be conservative so that we didn't exceed our revenues.
So we'll see for fiscal 25, basically, okay, now we know what it is. We'll get the advantage of where 23 and 24 at. On the budget side, rates that were higher than the rates that underestimated the usage, and 26 then, right, for 26 for budget 25, then we'll basically be adjusting.
Closely aligning with our rate model, which is a better predictor.
You'll see the budget number jump up, but the rate model was already predicting the revenues of what we saw. It was off last year by less than 1%, a little less than 1%.
So we'll see a tempering of the rate increase that otherwise would have happened.
Yeah, we're not going to have to adjust. I guess it's a long way of saying that, the rate model is sound, that we don't need to make an adjustment to next year's rate increase because of the perceived surplus. It was an error on paper from a budget standpoint. we showed a number that should have been 54, but the rate model did not reflect what we had in the budget. Is there an easier way to say that?
Yeah, if I may. So the rate model project what is actually happening. The budget document, for lack of a better term, was artificially lowered, more from a conservative standpoint, just given the impact of COVID of what has
So
happened.
eliminating that conservatism
Exactly.
in the budget means that the pressure on the rate increase will go down some before you factor in
Before factoring.
everything else, which may cancel it out. Plus, and we'll see.
Correct.
But going into the next budget season, we're gonna see a revenue jump, just
So-
because we're making that mind switch.
Yeah, so from a budget standpoint, going into FY25, you see the budget document line up better with what the rate model has been saying all this time, especially for FY26, they will be neck and neck.
We'll have a surplus probably again this year.
This year's surplus will mirror last year's, yes.
25 budget have adjusted, so we won't probably seeing everything else goes normal. We won't be seeing that kind of surplus because we will have adjusted our assumption of how many gallons we sell.
Correct.
And you wouldn't have a lot of variance from what you've been forecasting on the rate side because it's somewhat decoupled from your budget, the rate setting process looking every year. It factors in your beginning cash position at the end of every year. It back tests and baseline to actuals. So your rate projections, like for example, for last year, what they were forecasting, were already factoring in the higher revenues to some degree. So unfortunately, you might not see like a pullback in the need for the rates, even though your budget outperformed your actuals because the financial model was already anticipating that you'd be doing better if you will. Does that make sense?
It's that we are running ahead so far this year.
Yeah, and that's already been factored into last year's projections in the rate model.
So just to add to Mr. Terry's point, so the rate model factor in all those actual projections that we are saying right now, that, like you said, the budget was lower. We're looking at another possibly surplus of another 4 to 5 million on revenue, but the model already reflected that $5 million.
The model had it on the budget,
But- Budget to budget, yes, that's where we're going to fix that.
And the rate that we're going to meet the budget, that's where.
Yeah, that'll be adjusted in 25 years.
And this is the last revenue slide, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Ms. Lang. So, and we started to hit on this already, looking at Fairfax County's bill flows. And so we've seen variation in the last several years, but are taking a more conservative projection number from these variations because we want to account for that we don't know what we'll see from Fairfax County and not trying to rely too heavily on what those revenues would be.
We heard anything from Fairfax County to say that their portion of our capital, our CIP might be too high or nothing?
No, we just went through the AlexRenew cost share development. And it didn't come up once during those 3-year discussions. Took about 3 years to get through that agreement.
We see it come up when Alexandria says, hey, we need 4 more MGD.
That's gonna do it.
That's would be the.
Correct. That will be the piece that does. I think that and we do have, some upcoming capital work where we have to make sure the costs for homes run trunks are shared appropriately. So, there's the Fairfax agreement did enough for the plant, but it didn't touch the trunk sewers or the AlexRenew facilities, which were contemplated back then. So I think the big push will be when we go to deal with the 4 MGD, which we'll have to take up with both Fairfax and the city at the same time. Like what we did when we negotiated the service agreements.
Hand it over to you. Ms. Lang?
I like the Ferrari analogy because a lot of people say Ferraris are their baby. And I say that this model is my work baby. So I'm excited to show it off to you all and hopefully kind of get a little bit of background on what our process is. So we're going to go through some slides and we're going to answer this question, why do a rate study, in a few different ways. And we'll start with this bar graph and then in a minute go into the model and kind of play around with some of the worksheets in there. So this is a compilation of all of the slides that Ms. Feehan has been showing. These are our revenue requirements that are shown in the bar chart. We're starting with the operating expenses, then we add the debt service on top, IRR transfers, and then PAYGO, which is the CIP that's funded from cash. And you can see the bar charts are what our costs are, and then our main objective is to make sure that our revenues touch the top of the bars. And this is a gross representation, meaning that it does include Fairfax contributions in our revenues. As you can see, looking out into the 10-year forecast under existing rates and not adopted, just what the existing is, we do not meet those revenue requirements. And so this is just really a way to highlight that we know that there's a gap, and we know what that gap is going forward, and we try our best to plan ahead. And as we mentioned, this process does occur annually in very close conjunction with the budgeting process, and that really helps us capture changes incrementally so that we're able to adjust and calibrate the model and what the forecast is looking at. In addition, we're able to really have more predictable rates as we go forward based on being able to plan, and we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. So this really shows what the process is for the financial cycle. So usually the third quarter of the fiscal year, we're able to get the actuals. So we do use the annual report, the trial balance, and other actuals to enter into our model that helps us forecast for the next fiscal year and be able to analyze and make rate recommendations, which then goes into the draft budget for the next fiscal. And on the left side here, you can see that all the kind of components that we already talked about. It's a fine balance between making sure that we have the revenues that we need with minimal bill impact to the customers, while also balancing and making sure that our revenue requirements are where they need to be. So now we're going to have just a little overview of what the rate model looks like, and just kind of keeping it at a high level on what are some of the key components of the model. And Terry's going to share screen here on the model. So this is the fiscal year 23 model. So it's the model from last year. So some of the graphs might not match up exactly of what you've seen in the PowerPoint, but really the purpose of today is to show some of the key elements and what really goes into the process to make sure that we have reliable and accurate results. So the model is an Excel-based financial tool. It has 13 analytical worksheets going across the bottom here. We have 7 reporting worksheets and then an average of 10 or so source worksheets that feed into the model. We're starting on the first worksheet, which is the dashboard. And the dashboard really is kind of the main driver of the model. This is where we see all of our financial metrics, and we're able to really look at some of the key points that we need in order to make rate adjustments. So you'll see some of the metrics that Ms. Feehan has mentioned that include coverage, cash reserves, the CIP spending, and the revenue requirement that we spoke about earlier. If we go to the top of this, you'll be able to see that we have some navigational panes at the top, and then also all the way to the left. And this really helps us move throughout the model, and it illustrates, again, those buckets. We start a little bit different, where we start with the revenues and the customer statistics, and then go through the expenses and the capital improvement plan and some of the debt assumptions. At the top of the page, of course, the most important part is kind of what we program and the revenue rate adjustments to be, and then also what we calculate as a rate impact. So just a couple things to highlight here on the color coding. It's very important for us because it ensures accuracy and it adds a layer of controls and checks to the model. So the blue is an input, meaning that someone manually entered something into this worksheet. And usually where if it's a source input, we'll have where that input is coming from, so we can track who went into the model and who made those changes. If it's a red number, it means it's linking to another tab within the workbook. And then if it's a black number, that means that it is a calculation within that worksheet. And this is just one of the ways for us to track and make sure that we know where the information is coming from and that items are flowing correctly. So as I said, inputs, usually we have the source on where that's coming from. If it's red, we'll usually have a different sort of calculation linking to the same tab to make sure that we're communicating across tabs. And then for some of the black inputs, a lot of times we'll have two different ways of calculating items just to ensure that everything is really flowing through. So as you can see, we have a lot of dynamic capabilities on the dashboard, and the dashboard really controls the model. However, there's different inputs that we have to add within the different tabs that feeds the results. And we're going to just highlight one of them here, which is the customer statistics tab. This is the main area of where we input information that really drives where our revenues are. And I think this is a great way to tie in what Ms. Feehan was kind of mentioning and highlighting within our revenue tests and how we're projecting the revenues to ensure that we're really on par with what's happening. So you'll see here, typically we'll look at the 5-year projection of historical years. So we have 2017 to 2023, which is our test year for this specific model. However, we do have capabilities to go back to 2003. So this is really helpful because when COVID hit, we were able to look back historically and see what are some of the trends, what's the typical cycle, and if there's a year that is kind of an outlier or something strange might be happening, we're able to pick that up very quickly. And so here you'll see we have abilities to input for the different components of the billing statistic by customer class, and we're able to really see what we want to project as growth. So that's one part of the input here. And you'll see we're able to input it for each year, whatever we might think is appropriate. And I would like to note that for the forecast period, usually we look at the 10-year forecast because that's what the capital improvement plan is. However, we are able to go out all the way to 2053, which is the last year of our debt service payment. So the model has a lot of long-term capability and long-range capability. So you'll see here the main input that really drives the model for the revenue side is that we look at the average customers and their billed flows by class, and then we calculate the average monthly flow per ERU. And you'll see here, we're able to look at the historical, and then we're able to input to project how much we think each customer class is going to use. And here you can see this actually links up to the dashboard, meaning if we're in a meeting with staff and we're kind of reviewing everything and we want to do some sensitivity analysis, we can just stay on the dashboard and change the different assumptions and see the results right away. So that's kind of one of the advantages to this, is really having the flexibility and being able to do some scenario analysis within that. So once we have the flows per customer, we take that and we times it by the rates and to get the billed flows. And the rates, we look at both existing on what it would be if we didn't have any rate increases, and then what it would be with the different increases. And that flows to the revenues tab, and those calculations are then tied back to that revenue test that Ms. Feehan was really highlighting. And so here, again, the projection really is based on what the historicals are and some of the little inputs, and then we have that test in the bottom. Now, one thing to note is that we have a variance of, let's say, 0.45%. However, that's not necessarily the adjustment that we make for the projected years. We really take into consideration and make sure that it makes sense on what that adjustment should be. And just because the data is not necessarily giving us that exact number, that's not what we always use. We do take time and consideration for understanding and really making that adjustment before we put it in. So this is just one example of how we check everything. One thing I didn't mention, but for the revenue test, for example, if the variance is off by, let's say, more than 1%, and we've had that in the past, Mr. Boveri has mentioned that to me, what we do is we go back to the statistical data and we look at the details and we look at what might be the issue on why we might be off by more than 1%. And in the past, we found some errors within the billing data, and we were able to adjust and make that correction. So we didn't really take at face value what those numbers were coming in, even though they were actuals, because we understand that sometimes there may be some variances, and we don't want to just do the number that's given. So there is a little bit of an audit with that as well. That's good to know. Okay. So going back to the dashboard. Sorry. Just to kind of go down to the revenue requirement and really highlight some of the key elements here. You'll see that our goal is to really have and understand how we're setting the rates and what is the best plan of action going forward. So we want to have predictable rates. And the way that we do that is by being able to plan outside of that budget cycle, because we have the numbers for the 2 years and we kind of look at that. However, we know that we have capital improvement needs past the 5 years in the 10-year forecast. And so one of the items that Ms. Feehan mentioned in her slide is that in the CIP towards 2030, we kind of trail off and we don't have as much. Well, to compensate for that within the model, we have some placeholder allowances and contingencies for projects that may be coming into the future. Now, those are really in the out years, so the immediate rates aren't directly impacted. However, it does help us be able to plan and ensure that we have all of the revenue requirements captured that we might need in the long term. And again, there's a lot of changes every year. And so being able to update these numbers and calibrate it so that we are on the track with what the actual numbers are is really critical in this planning process.
Questions from this line?
Yes. I have a few more slides, but I think if you have any questions regarding the model itself, I'm happy to answer those.
just add one, and that is when we present us your kind of, you finish the numbers and you present us, this is what it said. Will you then also show us what kind of assumptions you made about long-term capital investments that in effect are not in our CIP? So we'll know, oh, you added 50 million, 75 million. So we'll be able to know how much of that is
Yes.
kind of a, you know, a guesstimate, because that's the best anybody can do at this point.
I think one of the things to mention too, that's gonna help feed this, we're not done yet, but we're in the next year, we're gonna be able to make risk-based decisions around our asset management program to better project our investments, and that's going to help make our CIP a little more accurate and being able to look at where we're seeing failures in the plant or where we're seeing failures, use that to drive our asset management model and take things from high risk to low risk. That's going to help us also be more effective in looking at those out years, that 10 years forward based on performance of our systems. We're going through the criticality analysis and risk management analysis now for our asset management system. It's just going to support what Diana and her team have been doing for us, the rate side as well, because we're better predicting our CIP looking forward. That's the beauty of asset management.
And what we found too is when we have low resolution about what those capital needs are in years 5 through 10, we might incorporate some allowances for known areas of capital funding, like let's say biosolids a few years ago before it was baked into the CIP. And so we might have some allowances there, but those are in the future years, if impacting the future year rate increases, not necessarily near term. It's just so that we aren't showing like necessarily a drop off. And what we have seen in this financial planning is that, again, as we get more resolution on those capital, what we've been finding is that conversion from what's been an allowance becoming the reality of the actual CIP. And right now, our allowances that we're incorporating in there have been declining, generally speaking. But we do incorporate that into the plan, and it does impact more of the future year, rate drivers, if you will.
We can go back to. Thank you. So what are the outcomes of the rate study, and also why do we do the rate studies, right? One of them is compliance with financial metrics. And here you can kind of see historically and then also projected, starting with the debt service coverage. You'll see that in these recent years, we're a little higher, and that's kind of on purpose because we knew that the AlexRenew debt is coming online. So we're kind of gearing up and making sure that we have coverage for the increased debt coming online. And similar with the reserves, knowing that AlexRenew is going to be a big capital improvement project. We were able to set rates anticipating the project, which would kind of built up our cash reserves a little bit. And then throughout the forecast, we kind of hover around the 365-day mark while we're executing the CIP plan.
This chart raised back to it. It's kind of hard to read from there, but what we have in front of us, a question of what our policy should be in regard to debt service coverage and reserves given the S&P AAA. Now they're minimums, but I assume that they're recommended minimums, and they're not hard you have to do when you really should. You're being abject if you don't. But I think one thing I just flagged we ought to think about and be interested in as we go through this budget or the next, or dealing with our ratings and net issuance later on this year, is whether or not we should say, our debt service coverage ratio, we're at a 1.4, 1.5. Maybe we just ought to be 1.6. And here's the impact of it. Or our cash coverage of 120 days that, it's not that far off from 150. We just ought to be 150. It seems we're so close to the sense that AAA recommended number from S&P. And I don't know if Moody's has or Fitch or whoever else we'd be using have different numbers, but I think that's a conversation at some point we ought to have.
Usually,
You, please.
I want to say, so usually, utilities and municipalities set those, hard benchmark based on those, rating agency. In addition to that, they do have a more restricted benchmark internally that they do go by. So for instance, the debt service coverage might be 1.5 based on Moody's, standard, but, like you said, like you, smartly said, like our internal benchmark do not have to be 1.5. We could set our internal benchmark to 2.0, and this is just in an effort. We don't want to set the internal benchmark way too high, to, for lack of a better term, just get ourselves caught in the corner. But we could always set our internal benchmark higher than what Moody and all those other credit agencies set. Most municipalities and utilities.
And they're more than just cash and coverage. Those are two of the most important, and the rating agencies all have different levels through which they would rate you a AAA rating, with Moody's tending to be on the higher end at like a 2.0 factor. And then you go down the line to S&P and Fitch that have lower targets, 160 or above, you might be AAA rated. But we've always come from the perspective of trying to figure out, okay, outside of the coverage, do we have a purpose for generating the rate revenues? Is there a capital offset? Because coverage, after you pay your debt service, what are you going to use that for? And so we don't want to necessarily arbitrarily build our cash reserves with no use of those funds. So we also consider other things, like, for example, if you're doing a generational capital investment that requires an enormous amount of debt, perhaps the coverage metrics that we normally see with other utilities might be elevated because we have an elevated amount of debt service relative to like other utilities, while we're taking into account SANUP back in 2011 through 2013, 14, and now AlexRenew. And so the coverage ratio, maybe that target could actually be a little bit high. And so, the 2.0 is AAA, and that 160 to 2.0 is kind of AAA. Historically, I think that, AlexRenew has been there, but we don't want to necessarily over recover for the capital needs of the system. So we look at more than just those two, but those end up being the most, critical ones that the rating agencies typically look at. So I would say that there's a lot of discussion internally with your financial advisor, PFM, Mr. Akukumbe, and the team from AlexRenew around what should be the fiscal policies. And I think that those are periodically reviewed. I can't remember. I think 2020 might have been the last time, or
December 2020. I think we're gonna about to also go through our own ratings with the numbers we're looking at here for our future debt that we're gonna incur to support our solids upgrade and our PPSU. And it'd be interesting to see where we come out on the other side, if we're able to stay at AAA with S&P, or if we're gonna get bumped down to AA, given the amount of debt.
We're not. Our financial advisors ought to be telling us you need to increase these numbers because the cost of higher interest rates because of rating reduction.
So we're just getting into putting the deck together now to go to the rating agency. So we have it on our list to review in the next 2 weeks to take a look at the presentation, see where we're at with S&P. Most likely that's where we're going to be presenting to in the next, end of May, end of April, based on the schedule we presented before.
The other way of dealing with it is you set minimums and then set targets above that. And you've got a whole range allows you to do that sliding based on circumstances. And it doesn't stick you to have to do the higher number, but says that's your aspirational number.
Right.
And you have your minimum that will do everything, make sure we don't go below. And that creates a band of financial maneuverability.
I would say there's a bit of an unofficial band. There's definitely the minimum with the policies, and then there's this band that, that the financial advisors recommend that we stay in within the financial planning. And that's typically what we try to do. We don't want to necessarily fall all the way to 150 if we can help it.
Additional outcomes from the rate study is predictable rates for customers. As you can see, there's not really any rate shocks. I mean, really high increases all of a sudden. There's been steady increases throughout. And then the last part, as we were all just mentioning, the rate study really helps with the annual budget process and then the capital funding plan and really being able to tackle those funding requirements. Going forward. One thing I did want to mention is when we do the rate study, it's a very iterative process. We'll update the model and then present to staff. You'll have many calls with PFM to receive different debt run scenarios and debt service. And we do that for some of the proposed rates that we're also analyzing at the moment and really making sure that all of the information is where everyone feels comfortable.
You can see that Diane and Terry wrapped the debt, proposed debt around the renewed debt on that slide if you didn't catch it in the model. That's the upcoming 10-year CIP.
This is the chart off my eye, like that, that big jump.
Yeah.
Which was smoothing. I assume that's part of it.
Could go 100 years on the bonds, Justin.
No, thanks. We've seen that result of that already. Good.
Hey. That's it on your presentation. Very much. You're welcome. Any other business? Talk about. Okay. Much appreciated. More educated and look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you.
Very good point. The motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor?